Hi, how's it going? Welcome everybody to the Public Works Commission meeting. Um, do we want to go ahead and do roll call?
Yes. Yes, thank you. Chair Maury Ferguson.
Here.
Vice Chair Charles Trevino.
Here.
Commissioner Ryan Jones.
Here.
Commissioner David Malling.
Here.
Commissioner Sam Hernandez.
Present.
We have a quorum. Thank you.
Great. We're going to jump right into the public comment.
We do not have any public comments for this meeting. None were submitted before 12 p.m. today, and none are here in person.
Okay, and I guess we can get into our presentation for the street improvement program and pavement management plan review.
Good evening, commissioners, and welcome. So we have a lengthy presentation for you tonight, but we actually moved pretty quickly through it. So this is the culmination of all the work we've been discussing earlier this year with regard to our overarching street improvement program and our pavement management plan. We had this discussion with MTech earlier in the year as well, and Public Works Commission. You've seen some of these concepts already. We had to do this a little bit backwards. We actually already discussed this with council a couple of weeks ago. We were on a timeline to complete the work before the end of the fiscal year in order to submit for some funding that was due by July 1st. And there wasn't time to actually bring this back through the commission in June since we're meeting in July. However, we still wanted to go through the culmination of all the work we've been discussing through the year and also get your feedback, as it's a lengthy program. There's several years of work ahead of us, multiple years of work ahead of us. So there's plenty of time for input. And so this will basically, like I said, be the final review of our current plan. So with that, I'm just going to jump right in. Okay, so a quick overview of our current street improvement projects. What we're calling Project 1, Monterey, Alta Vista, Sterling, and Forest, was completed earlier this year. Project 2, which the streets are listed there on the slide, is currently in water and sewer design. That's the first project that we're doing a full incorporation of all the underground utilities, and that is slated to be constructed in early 2025. We're actually going to move forward with Project 3 ahead of Project 2. That'll be constructed in the next couple of months over the summer, and that is the surface treatments on proposed streets that will show you which streets those are in the city on these slides. And then Project 4, which you've seen previously, it's small in size, but it's got a pretty hefty components to it. It's redoing the 2 intersections at Mission, Pasadena, and Arroyo, and you've seen a concept design for that in our previous meetings, and we're expecting to construct that in 25-26. Sorry. Is it working? Okay. So since our last update, we completed all the condition survey and identified the priority zones. We gave you a little preview of this in one of our last discussions. We've done several reviews with both commissions. We applied for a grant, the Safe Streets and Roads for All Action Plan, which actually is it's a 2-step grant process. This gives us an award that we can apply. We can build an action plan and then apply for millions more in funding for transportation projects. We developed our cost estimates and our budget plan, which we'll go over tonight. And this should say we discussed the plan with City Council on 6/18 instead of discussing. So the outcome of the program, just to give you some background, verifying that we do have about 68 miles of streets in the city. We categorize them for you as arterial or collector streets, local streets, which are basically the streets that most residents live on. And then we did include alleys in this assessment, and there's about 2 miles of alleys in the city. Now, this list includes private streets in our total assessment. We did take a look at the condition of private streets, which it does make up some of the alleys. However, our cost model does not include private streets. Those would be funded by the residents that live on those locations. And so really, the starting point for all of our analysis. Oh, please,
Quick
Chair.
question. You mentioned that there's private streets. How many miles of private streets?
Not many, less than a mile. I mean, you've got basically,
Okay,
you've got like
as far as-
Ashbourne and Shelton Way.
Okay, so that's kind of included in the 68 though?
Exactly,
This
yeah.
would be this could maybe potentially like 67.5.
Something like that. Yeah, it's not a whole lot. Yeah. Okay, so let me jump to the next slide here. So this is really quickly just kind of going through what we already showed you in previous meetings. These are the types of things that our survey team went and took a look at. We basically had a sample set of every single street in the city. We had a team of surveyors following ASTM standards, looking at various conditions, and then they basically have a metric in which they can identify the severity and the extent of these problems, and then compile those to develop a grading structure for the entire street network. So the types of issues they're looking for include things like alligator cracking, depressions, block cracking, potholes, obviously a very, popular one here. And you can see that the way that they grade these potholes are by the diameter and the depth. And so the severity of a particular pothole can be rated here, and that goes into the condition grading system.
Ted, thank you, Chair. Ted, I noticed you had some issues of subsidence of some of the streets. Is that also working on trying to fix whatever situation with the water that's causing the subsidence underneath?
Yeah, that's correct. When it's related to a utility, we usually have some other indicator that lets us know that that's a problem. If it's a sewer that's collapsed, we'll see the impacts of that, or a water break or things like that. A lot of times these are related to, say, a former water break that was repaired, but we didn't, in our urgency to repair the water break, we weren't necessarily able to rebuild the foundation of the street. So the subsidence might be related to a previous utility
Previous
issue.
break.
Yes, and that's why it's important, as you mentioned, as we do fix the streets, to actually fix the underground utility infrastructure at the same time.
Great. I'm glad to hear it wasn't a recent,
Yes, yeah. I mean, we have had some recent issues, but we're still everything is patched up and still operating as of today. So. Sorry, Rain, I'm having trouble advancing again. And so the majority of the surface of the streets in the city are asphalt, but we do have some concrete streets, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So there's a separate set of condition factors that we need to look at for concrete streets. Basically looking at things like corner breaks, punch outs, divided slabs, spalling on the concrete, and these all factor into the condition rating system as well.
Ted, quick question. If tree roots are causing, let's say, lumps in a street, which of these categories would it fall under?
It depends on what the condition is. A lot of time it's creating some sort of cracking that's happening on the street because the street roots are pushing up the asphalt. Sometimes we'll see if the tree roots are impacting the concrete curb and gutter. They don't really necessarily have a grading for that because it's not the pavement, but that'll cause some sort of underlying issue that impacts the pavement itself. So it just kind of depends on what the observed impact of the tree roots are.
Okay.
Yeah, there isn't a tree root category. It's more like what happened to the asphalt condition as a result of the tree root.
That was kind of one of the things that when I was reviewing this, that I was kind of thinking about was that I'm thinking of a couple of streets in particular where the roots of the tree are like saying creating ripples in the
Yeah.
In those cases where it's not split, right? The asphalt hasn't split. You're going to have a substandard driving condition, but then it's not going to target, and neither of these metrics would specifically hit that because if it's not open.
Sure. So like, Glendon Way is a good example of this where the tree roots on that street. So when we get a little further, you'll see that we divided the the conditions get divided into a couple different categories. One category is based on loading. So repeated cyclic loading and impact from vehicles passing over it. That wouldn't be the tree root issue. It would probably fall into either like a climate type of condition or some other type of condition. But yeah, it is factored in. It's just not specific to tree roots. And so this will probably jump right into that concept here. Yes. So, there isn't a obvious direct correlation between, say, a particular severity of a pothole, a size and dimension of a pothole, and a particular grading. In our previous discussions, we talked about our grading system goes from 0 to 100, 0 being the worst and 100 being the best. The consultant that we use to do the surveying has a particular algorithm that they input the types of distresses and the frequency and severity of them. And they come up with 3 different PCIs, pavement condition indexes, one based on climate, one based on loading, as I just mentioned, and then kind of an other. And so they take those 3 different factors and they come up with a aggregate score. And that's what we're going to show you is the overall PCI. But someone might ask, well, what score do I get if I have a pothole this big? It really depends on a number of other factors. And so it's hard to determine that unless you go through the whole modeling process that our consultant went through. Hopefully that makes somewhat sense. Let me jump to the next slide. So the last time we did this exercise was in 2020 that the city did this exercise. And these were the ratings that came out of that evaluation. So it found that the arterial collector network scored about a 68 out of 100, which is fair. The local network, a little lower, 58.9 poor out of 100. And then overall, the average for the whole city was 63.8. And that's that key number that we actually report to the state every time we do this evaluation so we can be compared to other cities. So not too much different from this 2023 evaluation that we did. You can jump to the next slide, Raina. Well, actually, before we do that, so this was the 2020 map. So if you look at the legend on the upper right, you can see the blue streets are in the best condition. Mostly those streets are from newer, more recently done projects. So you could see, for example, like that middle section of Monterey Road that was recently paved a few years back is in blue. The yellow section of Monterey Road that's on the very far west of the city was orange and poor condition. And that's the one we just recently repaved earlier this year. So you can see this correlates to your experience in driving on these streets. But the one thing to take away from this is that the red, the very poor, is spread out throughout the city. There's no one region that's immune to poor streets. Thanks, Raina. So let's take a look at the numbers from the 2023 evaluation. Next slide, Raina. Thank you. Sorry to make you jump around there. And so you can see the numbers are pretty much the same. We have a small decrease. The local network, that's actually a typo. It should say 56.5. So it did go down 2.4. The average went down about 1.8. But again, this is all very high level. A 0.1, 0.5, even a whole point difference is kind of subjective because it's based on surveyors going out, identifying all these types of distresses, and then that all getting aggregated into this algorithm model. So, there's not really a huge difference between the couple years. You wouldn't see it go up, but you don't see a huge, decrease, which is a good thing in most cases. Let's jump to the next slide. And so this was the 2023 map. Again, red is pretty pervasive to the city. That explains our low aggregate index. And there are some streets there that were since recently paved. So you have the remainder of Monterey. This survey actually ended at the end of 2023, so it didn't capture the new streets that we were paved starting in January 2024. Okay, let's
Ted?
jump. Yes.
This survey that's conducted in 2020, then you did one in 2023, and it looks like you did one in 24 now.
It was done it was originally done, the last one we have on record is 2015, then it was
Okay.
done in 2020. And then we did the survey in 2023, but it took us the last, 6 months to actually compile all the data, put all the information together, get the maps together. I think we got the actual data around end of April 2024, but the measurement was done in 2023.
Got
And
it.
that's important because, 6 months later now, the streets have continued to
Sure.
decay, and so it doesn't exactly look like this anymore.
And is that done by an outside vendor, or is it done internally?
Yes, we use an outside vendor, and all cities do this.
Sure.
It's recommended to do it every 3 to 5 years, but some of our funding is based on the fact that we do it every 3 years. So that's why we initiated in 2023.
And what's the approximate cost for a report to be generated?
So this costs us
Yeah.
for the entire survey, the GIS analysis, and the report was about $60,000.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. Let me try it here. Perfect. Thank you. So this looks a little familiar to you. This was the zone approach that we first introduced to you a few months back. And the idea here, I'll repeat, was so that we could start a new maintenance program in the city in which we are maintaining streets on a zone basis, and we move away from sort of the selection of picking streets all across the city. So, based on the previous map that you saw, all the colors showing the severity of the streets and their condition, the same consultant that we just talked about would typically give a city a 5-year list. They'd pick the streets that were about to go pretty bad and say, hey, you should go maintain these streets. They don't get terrible. And then they would pick the streets that are red and say, you should rebuild these streets. But that's kind of how our models worked over the years, is that those streets are sort of cherry picked throughout the city. And we have, which we'll explain in a few minutes here, the zone approach we're proposing offers a lot of efficiency in terms of getting things done in an area versus sort of hopping around. And so the question became, how do you divide up the city into these areas? And this is what the result was. So the factors involved in doing this were basically creating the boundaries that would follow major arterials and corridors. So you can see from the map, we're following, Fremont, Via Del Rey, Oak Street, Mission. And the idea there is that through a residential pavement management program, we're getting to the meat of these areas by fixing the residential streets. And then we're utilizing, separate programs, separate funding sources to address the arterial borders of the areas. And that'll be a little clearer as we go into the presentation here, but that's the idea. So the areas are divided up in that way. Sorry, Rain, I'm having trouble again. Thank you. So that these areas are roughly equal when it comes to street surface area. And then that division helps us promote project concentration. So we can have multiple projects in the orange area or the red area, and that's a lot more efficient. The reason that is because as Commissioner Trevino had mentioned, as we're able to get into fixing utility systems, it makes a lot more sense to develop projects in areas when we're fixing sewers and water lines. These current projects that we're working on, where the streets are sort of spread out through the city, it's difficult for us to incorporate water line improvements and basically cut them off at the intersection of streets where the water system doesn't necessarily follow that exact pattern. And so it makes sense from a network approach to do these areas. It's also a lot more efficient with the project mobilization, with organizing neighborhood impacts, parking. There's a lot of reasons that we would do an area approach. So this slide is more so for the council discussion. We just wanted to demonstrate that how this does not necessarily align with council districts, for better or for worse, but that the areas themselves are really developed because of the nature of those geographic locations in the city and not for any sort of political boundary. Okay, so the, if you're going to take anything away from this presentation, it doesn't really matter which area essentially goes first in terms of the plan, because over time, the idea is that you're maintaining streets in a given area in a given year. And so people have some sort of predictability in terms of when their streets are getting maintained. And then the areas sort of follow each other every year. So it, in theory, should be like a 7-year program. However, because of the sort of dire condition of many of the streets, it'll take some time to get into this sort of 7-year cycle program. And so what we really want to do is address the worst areas first so that we can try to be more efficient and save some money. We'll talk about how that works in a moment here. But we did take a look at the PCI scores per zone. As I mentioned earlier, they're not too different. There's not a big difference between the orange zone and the pink zone, 57.2 and 57.9. Very subjective difference there. And largely, all of the areas are not in optimal condition, but there are some areas that are in better shape than others. Namely, the center of the city, the blue area. And the reason that is because it has a large percentage of its arterial streets that have already been done in recent years, and they're in better condition. So like Mission Street is not in terrible condition, Monterey not in terrible condition. And so that sort of lifts the score up a little bit. And this gave us some guidance as to like, well, where do we need to focus in the next couple of years our resources? So, we have a lot of data here that we could share. We're not going to go through all this, but if anything, we're trying to basically highlight, and you'll see it in white. So the non-colored areas are what we're trying to emphasize here about what stood out to us in terms of the scores. So if we're looking at the entirety, and you can see on the left here, we have the 7 different areas, and then we've subdivided those into arterials, collectors, locals, and alleys. We could see that from an aggregate perspective, the orange areas and the pink areas, particularly the local sections, because that's what we want to address in this program is, people's residential streets are in, say, the worst relative condition.
One of the things that when we spoke about the scoring of these, one of the points that I had asked about was utilization, and that was kind of like asking, like that the use case of a street played some role in this determination, and that wasn't just the classification of the street. It was kind of like how we're accounting for residential density in an area, how we're accounting for if there are other modes of transportation available, how we're accounting for areas where, let's say, there is a grid, like if there's multiple connection points to a street that has, so versus like an area where there's a single street in and out and it doesn't connect, it's a dead end, right? So, and so I wanted to know if that has been built into this model, and if so, like, how is that? Where is that coming to play?
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad you brought that up because we did take that comment to heart. So in this, looking at these numbers, this purely is the condition data, but in developing our plan, we did consider that as we broke out the projects, and that'll come a little more apparent, and we'll explain some examples of your comment, which I do recall as we broke out the projects. Terrific. Of course. So let me just jump a little bit further here. Thanks, Raina. And so, if we divide up the areas per the general condition, so we're looking at the lowest types of condition here. At the top of the chart here, you'll see very poor and poor are orange and red sections. We'll see that, again, we see the pink zone has the highest area of very poor condition, particularly in the local network, seconded by the purple area. And then next up is orange with the largest area in the poor condition. And again, these are just high level numbers here just to get a sense of the relative nature. And so looking at the, the center, the fair section, we see pink again, and red entering the picture here. Jump to the next slide. And then, not to overstate that in the best condition of the city are green and blue. And now, those scores aren't terrific, but they're just better than the other zones. Okay. So now, having already talked about the condition, let's talk about some of the other factors that were considered. So, to the chair's point, partially about utilization, we did take a look at, the use type of the street. We'll talk about geographic access in a few minutes, but if we look strictly at the use, this is how the street network is broken up into arterials, collectors, and then you've got the alleys as a dotted line. The locals are just a straight line, and then those private streets, which make up a very small percentage of the city there too. Jump to the next slide. Again, I won't belabor this, but we had talked about the criticality of the utility line. So here you're seeing a map of our water priorities. So if it's in red, it's a improvement, a replacement of a pipeline that needs to happen. And the foremost factor is because of the fire flow that needs to be improved in these locations. The blue areas are where we need pipe upsizing just to deliver adequate drinking supply water to those locations. A lot of these pipelines that you see are either 4 inches or 6 inches, and they need to be upsized to 8 inches. And then the purple area you see is concentrated in the downtown, and that is really to fix the low pressures in the downtown area. So this would be a rezoning of that central zone into a new zone that would, especially with the oncoming development, fix that low pressure issue. So those are those water priorities. If we jump to the next slide, you can see that we basically fill in the gap where almost all of the rest of the pipelines in the city also need water replacements because they're aging out. So 90% of the city's water systems will have aged out in the next 30 years.
Ed, thank you, Chair. On the fire flow throughout the city, I understand that the pressure, some of our fire hydrants is not adequate. Is that correct? Is that something that, are you aware of that in some places in the city?
So it's a mixture of things. So, in some places in the city, if you were to develop something new, then you would need more adequate pressure. So, it really comes in like when we have a development project come in, the existing development has, what we would call adequate pressure per the fire code when that development was made. But if it's something new, then there's higher standards, and then we have to update the pressure.
And the reason I mention it because down there on the border of Alhambra and South Pasadena, which is right near Primrose Street, very near and dear to me, I noticed that the need for pressure zone improvements down there. Is that correct? The blue line? Is that what it goes?
So in that Primrose area, that's like, I think we're talking on the east side of Huntington.
On the east, yes, I believe so, yeah.
So it's not that there wasn't a need for a pressure improvement there. It was that from our consultants' modeling perspective, we asked them to, if we had to replace every pipeline in the city, which ones would go first and why? And so what they were basically saying is, well, you would do these red ones first. If you could choose to do them first, you would do them first because fire flow is the primary issue. Whereas like other pipelines in the city, it's not necessarily true that pressure isn't an issue. It's just there's other factors that take sort of precedence. So in that area, if you could see, it's hard to see on this map, but if it's a gray sort of blue, it's that the age of the pipeline basically was the critical factor. And if it's like a deep royal blue, it's that the size was a factor, not necessarily related to fire flow exclusively, but just size in terms of delivering um, water at all. So there's just a blanket condition from our consultant that all of these blue pipelines need to be upsized because they're just too small. It's almost a foregone conclusion that that's an issue. So it may or may not be that Primrose in particular has, a pressure issue for one or more reasons. It's just the prioritization of it came in sort of this pattern, if that makes sense.
So it was in that pattern of prioritization.
Exactly, yeah.
Designated that color in that area.
Yes. Now, sort of the conclusion to all that is if there were particular pipelines in the city that needed a prioritization over others that didn't need any work, that would be a simple answer for us. That'd be like, well, you don't need to touch the pipelines over here. So those, in essence, those projects would be easier and cheaper to perform, and we should focus on these other projects that need more depthful work. But it just so happens that almost every pipeline in the city needs attention in the next 30 years. So we don't necessarily, if you could lift up all the streets in the city and fix the pipelines in a certain order, you would do that, but that's not reality. So considering where the sewer improvements are and the street conditions and the water improvements, and going an area approach, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it's like all things being equal, we can address them. We don't have to, we wouldn't necessarily address the fire flow improvements as a complete street project before anything else, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot of
The collective
factors.
thing, I mean, a whole thing in a project that you would get 3 birds for 1 stone, right? And basically.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, this is just one of the factors being considered. I just mentioned real briefly, the sewer system is a lot better shape because the majority of it has been lined. We do have issues with older manhole structures that need to be addressed, and we still have areas of the sewer system, mostly point repairs, that need to be excavated and replaced, some lining, and that, of course, would have to be coordinated with the street project as well. So if you jump to the next slide, Raina, I think this sort of highlights some of those priority locations for the sewer system. And so, for example, we have a broken sewer line on Edgewood. And so that, the Edgewood being in our project 2 list being designed right now, that's an issue that will be repaired during that project. And so we're trying to tag all these in to the forthcoming projects that we do on the streets. I had mentioned earlier about concrete versus asphalt streets. Now, there's many of the streets that have a concrete base in the city, but this is showing you just what we see on the surface. And that impacts, as we'll get into in a moment, the prioritization and the cost of the project. It's a lot more expensive for us to reconstruct streets that have a concrete surface than an asphalt surface. And so you can see here, there's a few sections of the city, but mainly the largest section is Arroyo Drive. And you'll see that in our cost model later, the expense of doing that section of the city in the red zone.
Does that necessarily have to remain concrete?
Not necessarily, and that's a good point. So for example, our proposal is that intersection of Mission, Pasadena, and Arroyo, that little tiny section is currently concrete. And so we would actually replace that with asphalt. That makes more sense for our needs. However, it could be very expensive to basically rip out a good mile of concrete to replace it with asphalt. It might make more economic sense to keep it and just repair it. It just depends on the circumstance, but it's a very good point. And so, getting to the results of all this information here, we utilize all this survey data and we did quite an extensive analysis, both our team, our survey consultant, and then we actually had a separate streets program management consultant helping us with this work to prioritize where to focus our efforts on things that should be maintained right now before they get into worse condition, where pavement has not yet failed. Basically looking at every single street section of the entire 68 plus miles in the city and determining what we should do with it. And then calculating the entire cost for that entire effort. And that's what the council asked us to do. Again, many cities wouldn't go to this length. They would basically come up with a plan for the next 5 years, publish the list of what they're trying to accomplish. But our we were requested to basically come up with a comprehensive plan for the entire city. Let's jump to the next slide. Okay, so if you were to dive into the details of this, you would see from our consultant that they recommend all sorts of different things. There's different types of treatments and bonding and cape seals and slurry seals that they might recommend for a preventive maintenance. For reconstruction, they would generally recommend that we grind off the top layer of the street and we overlay a new layer, or we might have to replace the entire foundation of the street. For your digestion and the council and the public, because this is really something that we want to start providing information to the public about what's going to be happening on their street, we try to break it down into 2 categories. Either we need to reconstruct your street, which can be either a grind and overlay or more depthful construction, or we need to do preventative maintenance on your street. So a lot simpler, much faster, and basically keeps your street in decent condition until it has to be reconstructed one day. And so we tried to represent this on the next couple of maps with blue, meaning preventive maintenance. We call it treatment. And then orange as basically reconstruction. In a couple maps, you'll see orange as grind and overlay, and then red as reconstruction. But generally, we're talking about 2 different categories, one being a lot cheaper and faster, and one being a lot more cost and effort. So let's jump to the next slide there. So we did come up with a cost model for the whole thing. And as I mentioned, our consultant took a look at a whole different types of methods for reconstruction, from 65 cents a square foot down to almost $23 a square foot for concrete. We actually added costs on top of this for our staff administration, project management, anywhere between 7% to 30%, depending on the type of work that was needed and the type of the street. And so basically pulling all this information together, let's jump to the next slide. Well, before we get there, let me make one more comment here. Sorry, Raina, you can jump to the next slide, but what we're trying to accomplish here is with a long-term maintenance plan on the zone approach. Ideally, if we get to a point where we've repaired streets and we're just maintaining them, our costs will go down quite substantially over time. So this is a decay curve. It's used a lot in engineering for all types of applications, not just streets. But you can see a street that's in great condition, that's brand new, will stay in decent condition for most of its life. And then towards the end of its life, it will drop off in quality very quickly. And so the idea here, cost-wise, is to catch those streets before they have that drop off. And you can inject a little bit of money to keep that condition up versus paying a lot of money to rebuild it from the bottom up. You can't do this forever. And in fact, if you notice the nuance of those curves here at the top, each cycle of an improvement drops a little further and a little further. So eventually you do have to rebuild a street, but the longer you can keep it in that sort of up cycle, the less money it's going to cost you over time. And that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish here. So really it comes down to 2 parallel efforts. The blue areas, keeping them maintained and keeping them in good condition, and the orange areas, a little bit of red in there, rebuilding those and then getting them into a blue sort of maintenance cycle. Not to be confused with the color of the zones. We're using a lot of colors here, so please bear with us. But let's jump to the next slide. Okay, so as the chair had mentioned, when we're figuring out all this out, we have a lot of factors to balance. So the community quality of life and their expectations. So that's a big one, right? You know, we have people who have been waiting for streets to be repaved for many decades, impacts their quality of life. We have the future deterioration of streets, and that has a repair cost escalation. The longer we wait, the more those streets deteriorate and the more they're going to cost. We have construction costs increasing every day. You know, if we're going to defer projects, we're going to feel the impact of those costs. We have to consider where to put our money. Do we put it on arterial streets, which are used by not just residents, but the grander public who sort of use our city and commute through it, versus local streets? We're trying to focus on a local program. Alleys also get considered in there too. We have a lot of alleys that are very poor shape, but they don't get a whole lot of use. Safety and claims come into consideration here with the litigation that we have for when streets are in poor condition. Utility infrastructure needs, other transportation improvements, safety improvements in particular that we need to make on streets. And then the reduction of waste. And that's really going back to our slide with the decay curve. How do we implement a program that we're spending the least amount of money to get the most benefit? Okay, let's jump to, okay, so basically we laid out all of these factors, all of these costs, all of these condition. We laid out a 15-year program to repair the streets in the city. And this is how we built out the 24 projects in that program, considering all these factors. So starting with the project we just completed, we're considering this project number 1, Monterey, Alta Vista, Forest, and Sterling. Basically, we've taken these streets, which we show orange here because we reconstructed them. They're now in new condition. So project 1's completed. Let's look at project 2. Project 2 is the street one I just mentioned to you that's in design and will be built next year. And again, this was the older approach of sort of tagging streets throughout the city based on their condition. And so we're going to complete that project, and those are the streets that are represented there, including water and sewer improvements. I'm jumping to project 4 because I want to talk a little bit more about project 3, but this is the project that Commissioner Jones, we were just talking about at Arroyo, Pasadena, and Mission. Now, what I should mention about this project, it's very small. It's about 1/10 of a mile. But as we mentioned in our previous meeting, this is going to cost us about $1 million or so. And the reason it's going to cost that much money is because we're making all sorts of other pedestrian improvements, because this is kind of a little bit of a gateway to the Arroyo Park area. We want to improve the bike lane and pedestrian access. So we're not considering that full cost in the model. And the reason is because we're getting special transportation funds to apply to those improvements. Our model should really just focus on the engineering construction costs for pavement improvements. So in our model, this might cost $200,000-$300,000 to repave. In reality, it costs about $1 million because of all those other improvements. And that's important to consider when we're looking at it. We'll show you that in the cost model in a few minutes here. Okay, so if we were to take everything, considering all the data we just looked at, this is what our consultant shows us our high level needs are. So the blue areas are things that should be maintained. The orange areas are things that should be grinded and overlaid, and the red areas are reconstruction. Now, this is really high level. There might be some orange in here that could be blue, which is good news, right? We thought it needed reconstruction, but it just needs a treatment. There could be some blue in here that it could be orange or red, and that's bad news. And so we figure this out as we go through project by project, and we get into the design process. But this is how we developed what we think needs to happen in this city. Any questions so far on this?
So, we're talking about the street. We're talking about curbs and gutters, roots of trees, the overgrowth of trees into the street, and where there isn't a sidewalk.
That's right. Yes, let me add a couple considerations to that. So the consultant's costing analysis didn't include some of those things. However, the percentages that we added on to the costs that you'll see in the model do. So for example, it's hard to look at a particular street and say, you know, well, our surveyor wasn't able to validate the condition of the curb along the entire street. But if we know that a street needs to be rebuilt, we can estimate a certain percentage of that curb is going to have to be rebuilt too. And so we added a percentage to deal with that. Same thing with tree roots and things like that. Now, it could be just like any other high level assessment. It could be like a street has way more tree roots and way more curb problems than we anticipated in our financial model. So it's going to cost more. But in the same respect, it could have a lot less. And so it costs less. So really, we're looking at like really high level round numbers for the whole thing. It won't be until we get into each design project where we can pinpoint, okay, this is a problem here, there's a problem here. Same thing with like curb ramps and sidewalks. Now, this program doesn't include the sidewalks throughout the city, but it does include a small percentage of sidewalks that need to be repaired when we do a street project. So when we reconstruct the street, we need to consider the ADA improvements on that street, and we need to fix broken sidewalks, but we won't fix every sidewalk along that street if it's in decent condition. So, sidewalks in general need kind of like a separate program. But to your point, we do have a good element of that here to address what needs to be addressed in that project. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So the ADA curbs, corners are not affected in residential.
They are. So when we reconstruct a street, we're required to do that work, even in residential. However, when we're doing blue work, maintenance work, we don't necessarily have to address it. So it's really when we get to the reconstruction work. Now, curb ramps are kind of an interesting thing because there's very specific requirements. Some ramps are non-existent. Some are there, but they're just not compliant. So it really just depends on the circumstance about like how much cost goes into getting a ramp up to, up to appropriate standards. Yeah. So, I mean, we get into projects and we see, look, this ramp just needs like what we call it, like a tread plate, like that little sort of bumpy thing that we put on there. Whereas other ramps, we say, well, there's not enough room for a disabled person to park at the top of the ramp. So we actually need to expand the concrete zone at the top of the ramp. So it just depends on the situation. Okay, so let's jump to the next slide. So again, some more colorful charts here. This is showing us how much money overall we're looking at because of all these issues. So in general, you're looking at a high level estimate of about $43 million to consider everything in this city. And that's in 2023 dollars. And so when we're looking at these types of models, we're not going to do $43 million of work in 1 year, but you want to look at it in $1 or 1 year of cost so that you can compare future years. When you actually budget for it, you have to consider inflation and cost increases and things like that. But when you're doing a comprehensive plan, you want to look at it in a single year so you can do that comparative work. So in 2023 dollars.
When you did this assessment in 2020, what was the estimated cost at that time?
So the city's never done this assessment before.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And I'm glad you mentioned that because in the past, they've just done these 5-year assessments where they looked at what they can accomplish in 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is your estimated escalation on an annual basis if we were going to look at this number in 2026? What would you anticipate the cost to be?
Sure. So we do go over that in a little bit, but all things being equal with the way CPI, increases every few years, we're looking probably you want to do about 4% a year, 5% a year. We've seen, especially through COVID, we've seen 7%. But recently, I think we're looking at 3.9% for this past year. So I think that's a decent estimate, maybe closer to 6. But we go over that in a few minutes here too. So this is overall, and we've got this all broken down if you're interested in the numbers per zone and per type of street. Let's jump to the next one here. And then what we do here is we try to break this down in terms of the approach. So if we're talking the blue maintenance totals. right now, the baseline maintenance cost throughout the city is about $7-8 million to just address the blue areas. Now, at the very bottom, you'll see $1.1 million. So what we're doing here is we're taking a look at what we think the cost could be in 2023 dollars in the future if we were able to get into a model where we're just maintaining the streets. Now, I know that's a pie in the sky idea, but that's the goal of this program, is that after a certain amount of time, years, you're just maintaining your street and you're investing a lot less money per year to keep the streets in good condition moving forward. So in 2023 dollars, that's $1.1 million per zone per year. So every year you do a zone and you spend a little bit of money. Now, the actual numbers are going to be higher than that, but it sort of reflects the fact that where it costs $1 million just to do a single street project, you could be doing an entire zone for that maintenance cost. Does that sort of make sense?
So the 43 million for 2023 is the total project cost, but this 11 million represents if we were to maintain it at a later date.
So yeah, let's say we fix every street, and then you're just maintaining them. It's a lot lower cost. We're just trying to conceptually show you what the cost savings are. Think of that decay diagram that you're always saying at the top.
Yep.
And you're never really dealing with stuff at the bottom.
And then the 7 million on the right side, the bottom right corner, what is the difference of the 11 million and the 7,000,006?
Okay, so sorry about that. So we're taking every zone here.
Yep.
And we're applying what the maintenance cost would be in that zone. So the $8 million is all the zones. The $7.6 million is all the zones. But on average, it's 1.1 million. So let's say let's say orange zone. I just want to maintain all the streets in the orange zone. It would cost me right now, it costs me $1.29 million just to maintain all the streets in the orange zone.
But what's the 1.9 then on the orange zone? The 1 million.
Oh, sorry, that's the square footage. I'm sorry. That shouldn't be a dollar amount. That's an
Oh,
error.
that's not,
Yes,
okay, the
exactly.
dollar
Yeah,
amount's only
you're
on
right.
the
That's
right side.
that's
My
there
fault.
shouldn't be a dollar sign there. No, we do have dollar signs there. They
Yeah,
shouldn't
yeah,
be
yeah.
there.
I'm reading it. Oh, I do see the dollar signs. You're right.
Yeah, they shouldn't be there. It should be square footage.
Okay, that's where I
so-
got
Yeah,
confused.
exactly. Sorry about that.
Perfect, perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, just
Got
like the
it. So
top
the only,
line.
so it's not 11 million, it's 7,000,006 to maintain on an annual basis if we were to do it.
That's right. Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. And you wouldn't do every street every year. You do one zone, which would be about 1.1. Again, high level ideal situation.
Got it. Okay. Good, good.
But now to get to that.
So let's talk about that.
Well, we got to spend the 43 million to get to that.
So yeah, it's $43 million. And we'll break that down as we look at this here, but let's talk maintenance first. Let's talk good news, right? So, and the reason I sort of delayed this till later in the presentation is to talk about we should get started right now with maintenance projects because whatever we maintain from this point forward saves us money in the long run. So the first initial set of projects we're suggesting is maintenance projects. So if you remember much earlier in the presentation, we had those 4 projects we talked about and we sort of skipped project 3. So project 3 is a maintenance project, our very next project for this summer, fall to do. And that's our next slide here. So Marina, if you can jump forward to one more. Okay, well, before we get there, this is really just more numbers to break down what our current treatment blue areas in the city are. So 33.6% of the city is in this area where we can treat it and preserve its condition. And that's the cost breakdown for all of this. So if you add that up, it'd be the 7.9. Well, no, I'm sorry. That's a little confusing. If you see here, out of the $43 million, we're talking $3.5 million towards treatment.
After we finish the 43 million.
No, now we're back to reality. This is right now.
If we're going to spend money, we spend 3.5 million to properly maintain the existing condition of the streets.
Of these particular streets.
Got it.
Yes, exactly.
Understood.
All right, sorry, just one
Sure.
conceptual question. The preventive maintenance, you've got a 4 to 7 year lifetime predicted. I feel like maybe you'll be chasing the treatment the whole time. Like if we're only doing one zone every 7 years, and some of this stuff has only got a life of 4 years.
Well, we put 4 to 7 years because like, let me put it this way. On this initial pass, we're gonna try to push the treatment as much as possible. So there's gonna be streets that probably could use a reconstruction, but if they will accept a treatment and we will save money, we'll apply a treatment. So in other words, like they're probably at the bottom of the barrel as far as treatment goes. Now, if we rebuilt a street and we do properly maintain it, we're looking at 7 years, or it could even be better if we continually keep water from intruding the street, cracks from producing. So that 4 to 7 is a number that we have to give to the state to show what the life of those streets that we're about to do will be. But in reality, if the program's done correctly, you can really extend those life cycles. Like even a reconstruction of a street, we could say it would last 15, 20 years, but you can really push like 25 years or more. I mean, some of the streets in the city are in terrible condition. They've never been done, but the ones that are in decent condition and have never been done have lasted a long time. So it really just depends on the, the quality of your maintenance program. Does that kind of help paint the picture a little bit better?
So We're,
Yeah.
we're confident that like a 7-year cycle for treatment, we're not gonna be like losing streets, like they won't be dropping out of that category during the maintenance, like that 7-year lag.
Yeah, and like I said, like you can only get so many 7-year cycles. So let's say you get 3 or 4 7-year cycles, you'll have to rebuild the street every 20 plus years. And so the idea is that you will have to spend more money than $1.1 million a year, because if you could schedule those reconstruction efforts, you could space those out over a long period of time. But treatment it's a huge cost and saver, but it's not a solution that you just like don't have to worry about anymore.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, so let's jump to the next slide. So here is our project 3. So you can see here, this is sort of the buried lead, is that after looking at all those numbers, we need to start somewhere and we need to start maintenance projects right away. So in an ideal world, we're doing these at each zone, but what we would like to do is bite off as much as we can chew as soon as possible with treatment projects. So what we're looking at is the purple, orange, and pink zones this calendar year for treatment projects. Now like I said, we're trying to push this a little bit more. We could probably add in a few more streets, which our team is looking at right now to get them in the blue, category. But this is what we are planning to do. And this is what we had to submit to the state before July 1 to get funding for this current fiscal year to do. Does this kind of make sense, sort of culminating all this information? And Chair, I didn't forget about your question. We're going to sort of tag that in when we talk about reconstruction projects.
And I think a great idea is go through the rest of the slides, because I think there's going to be a ton of questions.
Yeah, of course.
Let's do that.
We'll shoot through. Yep, you got it.
Because I think you got some great questions and I liked your
Sure.
questions.
So as far as we're just going to go through the project. So Marengo is also in this zone. Now, the reason we don't want to do Marengo this calendar year, but next year, is because we're finalizing another study on Marengo that we can make some improvements to the striping plan, the painting and the markings on Marengo. And we feel like we can have that ready for next year. And so when this is more of a transportation type of issue, but as we do these blue streets, we have to repaint them. And if there's an opportunity to improve the painting pattern on them, we will do that. So, talking about bike lanes where we can add them is something we can talk about. Marengo already has bike lanes, but there are some improvements we can make to Marengo striping pattern, and we would incorporate that into the treatment project next year. So we've considered it as a separate project. So let's just keep jumping through. So then, the following year, 2025, we rotate through yellow, blue, and red, picking up the rest of these treatment projects. And then we come back through green. And since, to your point, Commissioner Jones, we're really hitting the 7-year cycle for some of these streets that were recently done. So for example, Fletcher wasn't done too long ago. So it wouldn't make sense for us to do Fletcher this year or next year, but by 2026, we're going to be pushing that 7-year mark. And so we want to incorporate some streets that have already been recently done back into the plan like Alpha was a street that was recently done, so that we can keep that cycle ongoing. Okay, let's keep going. Mission, we've sort of separated out as a separate effort. A little bit to the chair's point about utilization. Mission will require some special attention. We're trying to implement this slow street road diet on Mission Street. And so we think that, you could see bike lanes coming to the remainder of Mission Street. This is something that the council's discussing. And we want to implement that as part of the project when we do the resurfacing. Similarly, Orange Grove, we have a group of residents who are concerned about how Orange Grove is marked out. We have a particular issue on the north of the freeway that we're trying to identify. And so that would be a separate project as well. Garfield and Monterey, also separate project that now has transportation funding that's been granted to it from Metro, that we could implement a separate project and address some of the issues on Garfield there. And then basically coming back to Monterey and part of Pasadena that was recently done. But again, we're going to hit that 7-year mark and we need to resurface these streets. Okay, so let's talk about arterial projects. And these aren't in order of how we're doing them. We'll get into that in a minute. We're just trying to encapsulate the project. So I had mentioned about how funding works. So for example, we have $16 million of transportation funding dedicated to Fremont and Huntington. And so it makes sense for us to deal with the reconstruction of those projects as a separate effort. Now it will cost us, from the consultant's numbers, about $6 million or so to do the resurfacing of Fremont and Huntington. That's apart from any other improvements we want to make to, signals or traffic or pedestrian improvements. And so it would make sense to take that $6 million out of the budget that we have from other funding sources, instead of using our streets program money that could be dedicated to residential improvements. And so there's a nexus there that will help us essentially find more funding to fix these street surfaces through our other transportation projects. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there?
60 million was allocated by the state for these two streets?
By Metro, yeah. 10 million came from basically our 710 money. And then another 6 million was given to us for an active transportation project on these streets.
And we're in possession of those funds.
They get reimbursed to us as we spend them.
Got it.
So we're expected to start spending that money this year on design work.
And then explain the $6 million that you think would take to handle these streets versus the 16 million was allocated.
So the idea would be that the majority of that $6 million that we need to fix these streets would come out of that 16 million. We're already having to go into these streets and make transportation improvements. We're going to, change curb structures and redesign intersections. So in that effort, we're redoing asphalt and concrete work. And the idea there is that $6 million that we don't have to pull away from the general fund or some other source, that we could apply to residential streets that we can't get any other funding for. Metro's not going to pay for us to resurface Primrose, for example. Yeah.
Funds outside state from any metro in residential.
We can when they're tied to safety improvements. So when they're tied to safety improvements. So when we say we want to improve a sidewalk, we want to improve an intersection, we can. And that's some of the money we applied for, the Safe Streets for All money. So we're hoping to do that. But generally, we don't get special funding just to do pavement. Now, we do get SB1 money, state money, that largely comes out of, gas taxes. And that's what we had to file by September or July 1st. But in order to get that money, we have to spend $1.4 million of general fund money to get about $600,000 of state money. Now we're trying to change that ratio. It's a very hard thing to do, but we're working to lower our amount that we need to contribute to get that amount. But that's really the only money we're going to sustainably get. But I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end when we talk about funding. Yeah,
So Ted, this is our last slide. Are you gonna show this spreadsheet?
I'm getting there. I'll whip through the rest of these here.
Sorry,
Um,
sorry.
no-
I'm sorry, Ted. I'm so sorry. I just wanted to let everyone know we had some sort of error on printing, but the slide is gonna keep going on your
So
screens.
there's good
Sorry.
news for you. There's more slides than you thought.
It's okay.
Yes. So let's jump through the rest of these projects. So really we're just organizing the projects in the same way because of this. If you could just go through, Raina. So, we have a project on Fair Oaks. We have funding for some of this project right now. And so we need additional funding, but the Fair Oaks is a sort of a separate effort, similar to Fremont Huntington. Let's keep going. Okay, so we talked about arterial projects there. So now we're talking about the reconstruction efforts per zone. Here's the remainder of your $43 million. Grind and overlay here you could see is 31 million across the zones. And then go to the next slide, you could see the real reconstruction work, another 12.5 million. And so that encapsulates the whole 43. So really this is simple. Let's keep going, Raina. We're gonna go zone by zone. And implement these projects. Now, I think we might have skipped a slide or two because I want to address the chair's comment about utilization. So for example, if you jump back a little bit, there should be let's go a little farther, one more. Okay, no, I think it's at the end. We'll keep going. Sorry. So the idea here is to go through these zones and do this reconstruction effort. It's a big bite off to get through these, right? But streets aren't getting better. We actually have to address these sooner than later, and it's going to cost more the longer we wait. So we're really just organizing these projects. You just jump through these, Raina, zone by zone, over the coming years. You can keep going. By prioritization. Let's keep going. Let's hit blue and then or green and blue. Okay. Okay. Let's jump to the next section here. Okay, so now the last special section are these sort of like unique projects to address the chair's comment about areas that need to be sort of broken off for either earlier addressing or later addressing based on many different factors. So for one good example of this is Indiana Avenue. So Indiana Avenue serves as a collector, but also a residential street. It's sort of like the gateway to the hillside. And then there's a small section of Pasadena that's in pretty rough shape that's heavily utilized. It's right by the train tracks. So, for these factors and, considering all these things together, we've broken off special projects that need to be addressed in this way. So like this is one of them. Jump to the next one. Monterey is another one. Let's go to another one here. Meridian is really a special type of street for many reasons. The concentration of schools and other organizations and things like that. Let's keep jumping here. And then we mentioned Arroyo, and Arroyo is really kind of an unfortunate case because it's just so expensive to repair Arroyo that, our consultant might even say that because of that, you put it first, but we're actually putting it towards the end of the schedule because of that. The condition of it is in poorer shape, and it's not declining fast like some of these other streets, and it is a hefty expense because of the concrete infrastructure. So there's Arroyo. So, okay. The entire network, this is just showing you what this looks like if we were to map out these colors from the zone approach. The idea here is that we provide some sort of map for the residents to see how this is going to progress over time, where they can kind of click on their zone and see what's happening. So this is an initial idea of this. Let's keep jumping here. Okay, now we're at the end. So we've organized these 24 projects based on how our funding's organized. And you can see the blue and the orange here. So starting with project 1 through 4, and we stop calling them project numbers at that point. We just basically have them named about how we plan to progress through each of these, the blue and the orange. Now, the important thing with the orange is these projects take some time. The design work, the surveying, mapping out the water systems, other improvements. We need to start the design on these years in advance so that when every July 1 comes and we get our state funding, we can start building right away. In the past, we would ask council for an appropriation in June, and then we would start the whole process in July. With not really a consideration that project was going to take many years to actually build. So what we would like to do now is actually initiate a lot of this design work now so that these projects are ready to build in these cascading years coming forward. So you can see the layout of the project schedule here. The important thing to know here is looking about 3/4 down the page, that blue line, to Commissioner Jones's point, this is where we need to start that 7-year cycle. Every year, we're adding $1.1 million into the total plan. So we're maintaining everything that we just rebuilt in perpetuity, basically, until we run out of, cycles and we have to rebuild those streets. So if we take this 68, 69 miles, we have this $43 million need for the baseline reconstruction and maintenance. Then we add the 7-year cycle on top of that we have to start in 7 years. We're looking at a total for repair and maintenance over the next 15 years, 15-year plan of about $56 million. So let's jump into the last slide here. And this is our, the cash flow plan. So without going into a whole lot of detail, these are our funding sources, the general fund, our SB1 state money. And then to Commissioner Hernandez's point, we have a few other funds that we can tap. We have Measure M and Measure R. And then at the bottom of that top table, you see some of these special funds I talked about that we can apply only to things like Fremont and Huntington. And so as we look at this funding plan over the next 15 years, the second table down will show you how much money we basically have at the end of each year. So for the first 4 years, we spend everything we've got. In year 5 and 6, we start to run out of money, but year 6 can basically cover year 5 as far as spending goes. And then the bad news is around year 8 is when you start actually having a deficit for spending to keep up with the program. Now that deficit is about $8 million. So let me break this down for you. If the city is able to contribute $1.4 million each year from the general fund to streets so that we can get that $600,000 from the state, that gives us about $2 million contribution. We take a little bit of these other transportation funding sources that we're eligible for and we apply them. We can contribute a good $2+ million per year to streets. That would, be a $30 million in today's dollars over time. To apply, this model, basically. You can see where we're starting to run out of money. I'm not going to go too deep into this. We can if you want to. The final thing I'll say is that obviously we can't continue $2023 forever. There's inflation costs and cost increases. We tried to show you what that impact would be at the bottom of the model. Because all things being equal, the state money increases every year with inflation. The other transportation money we get increases every year with inflation. The money that doesn't increase every year unless we increase it is the general fund money. So, $1.4 million might go a long way today, but in coming years, it buys you less and less. So that money would also have to increase. So trying to give you all the details here without going too crazy, but I think you get the gist of the model and how this would work. All right, questions?
So, question.
Yes.
We're 56 million to do the street improvement program. So if I gave you $56 million right now, how long would it take to get that completed?
So it would take 15 years.
Regardless, if I give
Yeah.
you the money right now.
Well, so I mean, the money is one thing, right?
Sure.
But just the project delivery, the resources, the design efforts.
Totally get
So that's why we mapped that. Even a 15-year schedule, and I know when we took this to council, we were expecting some of the council members to even be like, well, let's make it 8, let's make it 5.
No, I get it.
Even 15 years is pretty aggressive.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So we've had other presentations from you about our water system and the replacement of the water system. What's that number again if we were to do that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
No problem. So the 30-year need for our water system has been modeled at $180 million.
180 million.
Yeah.
Okay.
That includes reservoirs, pipelines, you know, other
Got it.
things too.
Okay.
Yes.
The sewer system, does that encompass the sewer system? That one?
Yeah, 30 years sewer system, we're looking at about $15 million is what the model looks like. You could see there wasn't a whole lot of work on the sewer system, but it's still a substantial amount.
And from that presentation before, to get that done, and the presentation that you have here, what you have been sharing and illustrating in both presentations is, hey, there are certain programs that we are able to get the funding to do this through the state or for federal government, and we do that. However, with regards to this presentation, there will be a deficit, and then if I'm looking at it, the total requirement beyond current financing is you need around $15 million. Is that what I'm seeing total need beyond current financing?
That's,
14.9?
you know, all things being equal, that's us just basically kind of project out what's missing as we progress through the timeline and 2023 dollars.
Okay. So as we recognize, the city of South Pasadena has really improved, where housing sales are skyrocketing. This is a great place. The biggest common complaint that I receive from the local residents, Ted, is our infrastructure, you know? And look, we're well over 100 years old in this city. We have possibly neglected it to certain people, like, hey, when are we going to get our streets done? Hey, when are we going to get that improved? I personally think overall we're doing the best that we can, but I do recognize that there's streets that need to get done, and it's obvious, especially on the Arroyo section where everything was painted red. And I've seen these presentations before. I'm seeing some of the improvements, but they're minimal improvements. I know that maybe they come out to around 1.5 miles to maybe 3 miles a year, and we have 68 miles worth of infrastructure. You know, I'm still trying to figure out how we can complete this in 15 years, but I'm sure I might have missed that. But has there been a discussion about raising funds through, you know, I don't mean to say it, but I got to say it, a Melrose tax, where we get you this funding? Would that interfere with getting funding from the state accordingly, or could this offset the deficit? And why I'm saying it is, has that discussion been brought up? Because again, we are a city that housing prices, affordability, it's a very wealthy city now as far as the residents. Is this possibly a consideration for the city to consider, to look, we've got a 15-year plan. We need the funding. We believe we can do this, but we may need some assistance, because I think you brought up, Commissioner Sam Hernandez, is that a lot of funding isn't going to the residential streets. We're getting funding for the public street. But from a residential street, it's going to be coming out of the city's budget personally. And the majority of the streets of the 68 miles is mostly city streets. So my question is, how do we fund this?
Yeah.
How do we fund the sewer lines, all that? And is that a possible consideration? Because I think the residents would be, I don't know, support if we were to tell them, hey, we need to do this. Because we do need to do it. That's the problem. The problem is that we keep on seeing these presentations. I've been on this commission for over 4 years now, and I really haven't seen a lot of the improvements on the streets, and it's lack of funding. And right now the city's in a deficit. So I'm trying to figure out, how are we going to do this accordingly? And those are my concerns and thoughts, ideas.
Sure. So one quick statement on the how. There's so much that goes into this, from, you know, staffing to project delivery methods, you know, grants, and appropriately managing our resources just to get the funds that we are already entitled to from the state and from Metro is a ton of work. Raina will tell you this because that's one of the things that she works on day to day. So there's a lot behind the effort to get it done. Now, when we're talking strictly financing, those conversations I believe, have started with the council. We're still in the fiscal year 24, 25 budget discussions in order to adopt a budget for this year. They've seen this plan. Literally at our last council meeting. I think we had one more special meeting since then, but it's on the top of their minds with regard to looking at this long term. Now they've talked about, the ideas of bond measures and assessments and things have sort of come up in a cursory way. But now is the time for those types of conversations. So, with that said, the streets are one thing. Water and sewer are kind of a little bit of a different animal. You all pay rates for those things. So
Yeah.
that goes into the rate assessment. We basically take it up like 5 years at a time, and that's happening now to take a look at what that needs to be to cover just the next 5 years of our improvements. Say West Side Reservoir is one of those major capital needs in that time span. So yeah, there's a lot to discuss here. For us, we have enough money for this current year to do the maintenance projects we're talking about and to start the design on some of these projects. But we do need to have a serious conversation for, the next few years at least to see this program start. And we're going to have to make adjustments along the way. Maybe it doesn't happen in 15 years because it does cost, $6 million to rebuild a zone, versus,
And my only
yeah.
concern is if you throw in the CPI index and we were to base it just on the 43 million, that's a $2 to $2.5 million increase in costs per year.
Mhm. Yes.
So, and then he brought up a very good point is our 7-year cycle, we maintain it, but that ongoing maintenance is I'd rather be maintaining a perfectly redone street versus a crumbling street.
Right. And, a lot of that is the public perception. Like we need the public understand while even this summer, people who have streets that are in good condition are going to see improvements on their street, where people who have streets that are not in great condition aren't going to see anything happening.
Yeah.
And there's a reason behind that. So that's going to have to be part of this map and discussion with the public. But no, it's a very pervasive problem. If it wasn't, it would have been solved already and not have taken decades. So this is us starting to address it and
Well, that's
figuring out
why
a
I'm
way.
trying to
Yeah.
figure out what other alternative so that you all can go to work versus spending all this time. Okay, how else are we gonna, and I get it, you need to
Yeah.
spend this time, don't get me wrong. But my concern is, again, the residents always saying, why isn't my street getting fixed?
Mhm.
Why isn't this happening? And I keep on saying, be patient, it's coming, but those are my concerns, that's all.
Sure. So, if we took a look at our plan, you'll see how many projects are actually going to be worked on just this next year. We have 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 or 9 projects that are going to be in progress, whether they're mostly in design, but this is our best effort to get the city ready to have some major improvements, hoping that we plan well enough to have the money follow in. So if the barrier to getting these projects done is all this lead work, design, project delivery, consultant work, staffing work, we can do that now at lower cost to get ready for the big chunk of construction that's coming our way. And our hope is that, you will see tangible improvements if we're able to knock this, initial work out so that we have what I'll call shelf-ready projects ready to go in the coming years, that as the financing comes in, we can pay for them.
So the recommendation I would have, Ted, with regards to when we go to public and we share with them the information, is somehow condensing this and putting it in a term. Hey, your street or this area is slated to receive a 25% improvement in the next 3 to 4 years, and your area will be improved to this certain percentage according. Those are some of the things that I would
Yeah,
recommend.
we gave you every
Yeah,
little
no, I
detail,
get it.
but you're right. what we were trying to do is break it down into two categories for folks. You know, they'll basically people will look, it'll look like their street is getting painted black this summer. You know, that'll what a treatment will look like
Sure.
versus people who actually have something where they got, you know, their street getting ripped up. And then they're in a particular zone. So we tried to break it down into this geographic understanding and then what is actually happening in their street. And that's the idea that we're trying to
And then
convey.
if we could have follow-up when a street does get improved, we're advertising that. Hey, look what we just did. These funds came from blank. We're having the advertise. We've got the poster up, but we're shooting out the email about that. We're providing photographs. The mayor's talking about it. Hey, by the way, I just want to let you know, we just applied X amount of improvements to the following streets. Who are those residents right there? So the mayor is doing that, promoting, we've got more coming in. This is how we're doing it. We're improving the city. We're just not hearing that these days. And I think that's something that we need to do because it's marketing 101 too, because I'm sure, Mayor, that's a big common question that
Well,
everybody asks.
it's a good point you make. So like, for example, what the city used to do for these, what I'll call the blue projects, is they used to do complete design packages for them. We're no longer doing that. We're wiping out the design work. We're really turning this into a much faster maintenance process so that every year we're really doing the same thing. But we're just basically picking new streets. And so like we've made refinements in terms of like how these are delivered that's taken us a while to do so that for the future things happen much more like clockwork over time. That's the idea. But yeah, that's part of, you know,
Yeah.
what has lacked
Yeah,
previously.
and if we
Yeah.
could just make the public aware of what improvements we are doing.
Yeah.
And get it out there. So it's, hey, please drive the street. Coming to you soon, you know? If coming to you soon is like a year from now, and we just say, hey, no, we've got you slated. They're like, okay, it's coming in a year. Good, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I think some of the folks that we've talked to, because we hear about this a lot, as you can imagine, we're showing them that design efforts are starting sooner in there than later. That somewhat appeases them, even if it is like, you know, 3 years away till their street actually sees some
Sure.
work done on it.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Again, hopefully from your presentation, it looks like we still have a $15 million deficit. So we just need to figure out where we need to get that from. But thanks for the presentation. Any other questions?
The point of utilization, I'll come back to that. I haven't seen in here where like the traffic is considered. And so when I was looking at the proposed area for the first section of the zone that's going to get to be done. In a lot of the cases, those are streets that are on a grid that have multiple access and the entry point. So the streets it's like that's a less use than a street that's only has a single access. So every car has to go down this road, like, you know, versus like they can go either way, get off the street. And so I want to know like specific, like we're talking about public perception or how people get to know that their streets are being worked on. If we're not looking at the traffic and the way streets are used, then we might be targeting streets that represent a very small percentage of the population versus streets that you know would represent a lot of residents. And so I mean I'll repeat the question because it's not clear to me how that's being factored in.
Sure. So, you know, what we try to do is consider it as a factor and put it into how the projects are developed. So the places we were able to do that are, you know, first off, it's a couple different things. Initially, it's the zone. So where the zones are purposely aligned to streets that get heavy usage so that a street can fall into either zone. Like Oak Street is a good example of this. Oak Street borders the pink, orange, purple, and blue zones. Right. Well, I mean, so Oak is a collector. But the idea there is that, you know, Oak also services, you know, it's right near some of the schools. So as far as the project prioritization goes, we could put that anywhere. And then even some of the, we envision safety improvements are necessary in Oak, and that was one of the experiments that we did earlier this year. So that's why, Oak as its own, basically is like sectioned out of the network as its own particular street, similar to how we treat Indiana. Now I think you're talking about is like a refinement down to the residential level, like within a zone. And so what I would say is, so that's how we tried to address your comment, but I think to go a little deeper, because I think that's what you're asking. When these are high level numbers. So like, let's take the yellow zone, for example. We might not be able to afford the yellow reconstruction project idea that we just proposed, because we might get into that actual design work and find, well, these streets cost more to do because of A, B, or C, tree roots or whatever. In that case, we'll have to prioritize which streets get reconstructed, and we'll have to split a zone, at least for the initial round, split a zone into a couple different projects. And so that's where it would make sense. Like, how do we pick a street within a zone? That's where we have to apply what you're talking about. On the grander scale of like weighing one zone versus another zone, we didn't take the approach you're talking about specifically, because what we're trying to do is save money as the foremost factor, if that makes sense. So we try to take, in summary, we try to take what you're talking about in consideration about utilization by sectioning off projects, considering like some of these have to be special. We can't group them into, even if they're not a border street, we have to group them, we have to sort of separate them out. That was sort of the first net valuation of your comment. On a secondary level, exactly, Indiana, yeah. So like on a secondary level, if we have to do that at the residential level, like within a zone, we will have to do that if we can't afford to do an entire zone. What we felt we couldn't do was apply that particular factor to weigh the zones against each other, because that doesn't get to the crux of the issue, which is affordability of the program. So hopefully that makes sense, where it's like you've got a dozen or so factors that you have to sort of subjectively mash together. Yeah.
I think that anything like this
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that like where we as like a public facing entity have to focus is that like, how are we accounting for like the representation of our citizens, right? And so like if I were to look at an area like, let's say in the green, we have like Raymond Hill. So I know that that's a high density area. There's a lot of apartment buildings there. That means a lot of residents getting in and out. So that would tell me that like any kind of work on the streets there would be something that would be something that I would want to be weighed. Is that like, especially if it's, when you start talking about what the prioritization, if that means that we're going to be repaving, surfacing the street, it happens. So it sounds like if there's a pathway that can be clearly communicated, that can speak to how people's needs are being met, then I think that.
Sure. And do we get that? I think that, so like, let's say we could, the earlier approach, there wasn't anything wrong with that earlier approach of basically like picking streets throughout the city. And that's what happened. Basically, the consultant would have used that, that loading PCI to determine that, these streets get particularly heavy usage. So even if the overall PCI is this versus this, they get so much loading on them that, if we want to prioritize that, then we should prioritize that street. And so that was kind of the former approach, was that's how streets kind of got picked around the city because of one reason or the other, condition and amount of traffic. If we do want to move into the zone approach, which is just one idea, it's not, it might not be the best idea. We are not going to be able to do that on like a residential street by residential street basis unless we have to start prioritizing within the zone because of cost. So it's like you said, it's a concern. And certainly we try to service residents in those communities in a different way. For example, the reason we prioritize ADA improvements, the next round of ADA improvements in, um, the Raymondale area is because of that high concentration of multifamily, not streets, but other improvements that we can make. It was for that exact reason. So,
So I feel like that's the thing, like, next step is refine kind of figure. Like, in the Sam's point, where there is safety improvements that the additional funding, right? Where it's like, I think that's what you mentioned about residential streets, if I heard you correctly.
yes, that's what we're hoping. And to that point, there's plenty of decision points that have to be made throughout each project. Like, even in these past projects we've done, we had to make tough decisions about which ramps, what the boundaries of our project were going to be, because we either have to avoid doing a ramp because we're required to do a ramp when we do a project this. So if we have to pull back the boundaries of our project because we just can't afford to do the ramps, that's a sad decision we have to make, but we do have to make those. And so there's going to be plenty of those opportunities when it gets down to the really local level about like what a project entails just because of that, those impacts. But yeah, so hopefully we can make those, decisions in the best interest of everybody.
I previously asked about a street damage restoration fees. Were we kind of able to get any traction around that?
So we have, in parallel to this effort, we have a whole bunch of sort of financial evaluation efforts that we're pursuing this fiscal year we just entered into. So we have this assessment of our maintenance of effort, this $1.4 million contribution. Can we get that lower to get the same amount of money? We have this effort to look at developer impact fees, which would include that concept that you're talking about. And that also has a couple other factors to it as well. It ties into like the master fee schedule and a few other things. But yeah, that concept you're talking about, we're trying to get some professional financial engineering consulting feedback on what we can legally do and what's fair to do based on that comment. Yeah.
That would impact utility to developers, but I'm wondering if that impact.
Yeah, so it would be street infrastructure, water, stormwater, and
Well, specifically, like Edison.
And sewer.
Edison, do a span. They're gonna cut off the street, put a set of projects. Would that then trigger them paying a street damage restoration fee if that was a street that was just free?
Sure. Edison's tougher because they're public utility. They have already specific rules. They're actually literally rules like rule, 20, rule 12 that they have of what they're obligated to do when they impact a city that we have little control to demand from them because they're a public utility. But other, other utilities, say like or maybe not utilities, but other users of the public right of way, we could access those fees and implement. So yeah, it just depends. Again, it's like kind of goes back to this nexus of what we're legally able to accomplish.
Okay,
Yeah.
so with all these graphs and all these reports and everything, what will it take to start?
Well, we already got our council direction to start, so we submitted this blue list, Project 3, to the state. We have a bid package that we're finalizing right now. We're trying to add in a couple more streets to release and have the construction occur this summer. We already have this other project getting ready to build over the this coming winter. We're starting design on projects. So for example, we've already reached out to our consultant to get proposals to bring to council to start the design on the projects you see that are in design in this current fiscal year. We're initializing these financial evaluation efforts to see how we can impact fees. We've already submitted grant funding for some of these programs we've talked to you about. We actually heard back from the grant program today that we need to give them more information by tomorrow. So yeah, we've got a whole bunch of efforts that we already initialized. Really, the presentation tonight was to gather your feedback and any other things we should be looking out for, which I think we got plenty of good comments tonight on that. So,
I have one thing to say. The way that this is reported, could, is this something where like there could be like a standing report as far as like miles completed of like the total amount and like, cost per mile, how that fits into our budgets? That way we know that it's like being tracked in a way that kind of aligns with this vision of being a 7-year cycle.
we would like to do that. And in fact, there's two efforts there. Looking at unit costs is a big deal for us because to cost all this out, we had to basically make sure our unit costs are reasonable. We want to track that we're keeping to those. And then number two, really for the public's perception, like what's next, when am I street getting done? We would really like that to be something that's on our website that people can access. We're just short on those types of resources at the city as a whole right now to implement. So we're hoping, in the coming months, we have an ability to initiate something like that. We'd be looking for your feedback on that too.
So I do think what Commissioner Omari is saying is, I really think it's important that we get this feedback to the residents.
Mhm.
So that needs to be something that's got to get worked on because again, just going to the website isn't going to cut it. We need to figure out how do we get our Chamber of Commerce involved? How do we get our local periodicals involved where they'll come and interview the mayor or interview you. Say, hey, we just had a great meeting. This is what's going on. It gets out. We're not seeing, right?
Yeah.
So those are very inexpensive. It might be a little bit of time, whatever, but something like that, where volunteer you, maybe he speaks on behalf, I mean, stuff like that. Whatever. But stuff to get that promotion out there where we have it. You provided us at one time, 3 years ago, an analysis on our water and how clean our water was. That was actually brilliant. When anybody asked me, I would hand them that pamphlet. Hey, by the way, it's on the website. That to me was such an incredible resource that I was able, and they're like, wow. I go, oh yeah. This city does a really good job on making sure this water is clean. You can drink your water.
Yeah.
And here you go. Right.
That is a wonderful thing that we have. That's a required report that we do. The state requires us, and we have a resource built in that's been refined over many years that allows us to do that efficiently and fast. I think what you're saying is a great idea. As a new program and our resources are dedicated to actually getting it done, I think it would be difficult for us to do, but I do think it's a good idea as our at a higher level in the city, as we get new administration and resources involved. I think it would be important for us to have those discussions to see how, citywide we can
And
implement
Ted,
what you're doing.
if you need to sub this out to a marketing department or to somebody to do it. You've got the funding could still be the advertising or the promotion can come from your funding. It's minimal.
I understand. It's difficult to sub anything out. We will.
Are you saying it's very easy for me to make comments?
Yes. But I think it's a really good point. I think it's something that we should prioritize and talk at a more global level here at the city about how we can advertise this information because it is a high priority issue. So
Could also be agenda. So like if there could be an agenda item in the council meeting, talking in MTech or this meeting where we say we've done pavement update and then kind of where we're at. So,
yeah.
but I mean, I think if there aren't any more questions or comments regarding presentation, then I think we have one more item, which is the approval of the minutes.
Move approval. Move approval.
Oh, yeah,
item.
that's right. Let's move to approval. So I make the motion that we approve the presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Ready for a vote?
Yes, did you want to go ahead and move forward with the minutes
Yeah.
for May 8th? Okay, is there a motion to approve the minutes for May 8th?
Yeah.
Okay, and does anybody want to second that? Okay. I'm gonna just take a quick voice roll call. Boy, sorry. Okay. Chair Ferguson, Yeah, Vice Chair Trevino,
Aye.
Commissioner Jones,
Aye.
Commissioner Malley,
Aye.
Commissioner Hernandez.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously 4-0. Thank you.
All right, and then, so moving right along, communications, city council, liaison communications, anything? No?
Yes. First, I would like to thank Public Works for their exemplary work on the July 4th. I was really successful. Um, eh, we did it differently this time. We had to collaborate with the police and fire due to some security intel concerns. We had actually one police officer tag along every dignitary along the parade route, um, which was kind of different. But the point that I'm making is that Public Works, the day previous, they were already working on, placing the barricades, and then the day of, they probably woke up around start around 3:30 or 4 a.m. To meet the 7 o'clock pancake breakfast. So it until 10 o'clock probably at night after the fireworks. So it's I can't thank you enough, Ted, and your personnel, and they worked tirelessly, and it's a whole community effort, and bringing, and it has not been unnoticed by the residents, so I got lots of positive feedback, and thanking the Public Works for um, doing everything seamlessly. It just flowed from pancake to opening ceremony to the parade to the games at the park. Oh, I was able to dunk Councilmember Primus. But anyway, then the fireworks, and then probably afterwards, you had to clean it up. So that's nobody ever think about the cleanup afterwards, and so I can't thank you enough. Public Works, just magnificent. Thank you. And we have the multicultural event coming in September, September 28th on Mission, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And purpose of that is to introduce different culture from all over the world. And so we would like to attract businesses in that way. So so it's kind of a dual purpose. Introduce South Pasadena to future businesses, and also to give the community a sense of belonging. We are a melting pot. South Pasadena is a small community, but I find that there's diversity in this community. So coming up, look forward to September 28th. And starting next month, I will be having the mayor's meetings once or twice a month, with in mind the street, the zone programs, and also advertising, step by step to the public, so that they are well aware of what our plans are and progress. And I'm sorry, but as mayor, this is my year, and I actually have weekly follow up with staff, and so sometimes I overload them with orders, marching orders. But thank you so much for putting up with me. You only have to put up with me until December 31st. But everything is on cue. We start the pocket parks, both of them simultaneously, probably next month, um, and of course the streets. With that, also piggyback with the bike lanes, the sewer, and well, the sewer and water piping, whatever needs to be done. But so it's a very complex project. So The more, as you said, the more public outreach, the more the community understands, the better we all feel. And I know that we're struggling to balance the budget. So my question to Ted is, these are 2023 figures. Now, we're going to the 24-25 proposed budget. Can we then use these figures for our proposed 24-25 budget, considering the CPI increase?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, really, we're just talking, we know when we put this in $2023, it's so we can talk about this program relatively over, decade or more. We've budgeted sufficient funding in 24-25 for the projects we're going to take on, considering the construction costs in this current fiscal year. So, since we haven't requested any appropriations for future fiscal years, because that's not how the city's budget process works, we're really just focused on what this year is going to cost, and that's included.
Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. I guess any commissioner communication?
No, I think Evelyn covered the 4th of July, which was absolutely wonderful. Thank you all, because it came out better than expected. So I thank you.
Comments? Okay, all right. So then I guess we can go into the, I guess I did have one thing for the commissioner communications. This is a lengthy presentation, and there was a tremendous amount of information contained with it. I think that it's almost unfortunate that Ted would have to get up and give this presentation multiple times. As far as like, if the same presentation is something that's given to MTech, I would ask that we can find a way to maybe just have both commission meetings at the same time. I don't think there's plenty of seats for the public to sit in. I think that maybe something like this, we could look at the feasibility of doing it. So maybe just give you one less night of going into this type of level of detail. I think it's extremely beneficial. I just think that if we can knock out two birds with one stone, that would be a great thing for everybody. So that's something that we can explore, and then maybe we can get some kind of report back of the feasibility of that, if that's something the city clerk needs to chime in on. But what I'm envisioning is just that our meeting is scheduled at the same time, so there'll still be two commissions, but then we could essentially have the presentation once and both commissions. So that's it for my commissioner communications. Any staff liaison communications?
No, I don't think we have anything tonight. Yeah, thank you so much for the comments.
We've done plenty, so. All right. All right, well, I think with that, we can adjourn at 8:24. All right.
Thank you so much. Meeting adjourned.